I'm Nolan Bushnell, and I founded Atari in the 70s and later did Chuck E. Cheese and have been involved in the game business pretty much my whole life. I'm fascinated by the innovation that can happen in this marketplace that is dynamic and always changing, and I expect to be engaged in games for until they take me out feet first.
Where do you see the tech world now, and do you think that we're in a bubble?
Bubbles happen because of shared delusion. I mean, and you can look at all the past bubbles, and I think the early one that was, it wasn't even the first one, but the early one was the tulip thing in Holland. Where half the GDP of Europe went to Amsterdam. Crazy stuff like that. And what happens with bubbles is that a lot of times it's a shared vision, and sometimes it can be a sparsity of opportunity. For example, right now, since there aren't 200 smaller tech companies to invest in, you have your choice. You can invest in Apple, you can invest in Google. You don't have this panoply of other opportunities, and I think that's bad because it forces many times young, vibrant companies to sell too soon just to get capital. And when that happens, you have older dinosaur managements supplanting the young, vibrant, dynamic managements. I mean, I think that a outside observer would definitely conclude that Warner Communications screwed up Atari massively. They put in money at the right time, but there was no innovation after that. They just shut innovation down because they didn't understand it. They didn't understand the technology. They thought of Atari as a record company. They saw it as, the software was the whole thing. They didn't care about the hardware. In fact, sometimes they'd say, well, is there a way we can offload this hardware thing? It's all about. And I said, not only that, this player is obsolete the day we shipped it, and we have to replace it within 3 years. And they wouldn't do it. And the real crash in '83 happened because the 2600 was over. The 2600 was obsolete, and they tried to push 15 million into the market in a market that was already full. And whereas if they'd had the VCS2 or some other thing, it would have kept the market alive, because the early adopters of the VCS would have bought the early units here, no matter what. And it's the model that we see today.
So you sold the company, you sold Atari to Warner Communications, and what was the transition like after the sale?
The company transitioned. I mean, the corporate culture is really a combination of the people and the management. And I felt that the best way to manage a company was being really a cheerleader, saying, let's all take that mountain together. And so we had certain policies that were, I guess we tried to make the place somewhat egalitarian. For example, there were no reserved parking spaces. I said, first guys show up, get the best parking space, everybody else has to walk from the back. When Warner came in, all of a sudden, every vice president had a reserved parking spot. The chairman came to work in a chauffeured limousine, and all of a sudden there was an executive dining room, and I just think that is a us versus them mentality, and I always felt that the true stars at Atari was the engineering, the excellence of our creativity, and so those are the people that needed to be pampered, not some badass executive.
So do you think there's a very clear cultural difference between, say, a major corporation and a younger, more innovative small business or startup?
I think that that mature companies, by their nature, have a different view about risk and control. I always say that when it costs more in paperwork to buy a pencil than the pencil's worth, you've gone too far. And a lot of times big companies end up in a procurement cycle that is burdensome and stupid. And so what is much better is setting up a new division, letting them go to a new portion of the company. I mean, when we set up the consumer division, I told Al to go find some space, and they had refrigerators with beer in them, and their dogs can come in, and they didn't have to wear badges, and that's totally appropriate for a company under 50 where you're all working on an interesting project. It doesn't actually work when you're 300 to 500 people, because all of a sudden you get a few bad actors that you sort of have to be able to monitor and shut down. And so size causes some problems that are antithetical to innovation and fast movement.
And so if you knew then what you know now, would you make a different choice regarding selling Atari?
I sold Atari because I felt it was the prudent thing to do for Atari at the time, because every time I pushed the numbers, I could not figure out a way to fund the VCS for the following Christmas. However, knowing what I know now, I actually think I could have gotten the company public. One of the things that scared me was we were actually writing an S1 for an IPO with Dean Witter, and I got the telephone call, and the telephone call is always the same one. Oh, the market isn't quite what we thought. I don't think we're going to be able to raise quite as much capital as we told you they could. What that really means is investment banks don't care about the companies. Companies come and go. They care about their investor base. And they want the company to sell shares as cheaply as they can so that their customers can make a lot of money. Because the customers are there with them every year, and if they make a lot of money on Atari, then they'll buy something, and brokers are transaction guys. They just want to churn the account. And so I didn't realize at the time that every guy who's running any company that wants to go public, they get you landed, they promise you a great big valuation, and then they call you and tell you that they screwed up and they're not going to be able to get you as much once they've got the hook set where you can't really go anywhere else. And I think that they scared me. And I think that was because I was young and naive. And so, do I regret selling Atari? Absolutely. I think that I could have solved the problem, and that I've often said that I was tired and scared. I mean, not really scared, but I didn't want to do the wrong thing, because I saw this huge opportunity for the programmable game. And I didn't want to run out of money. And it had been a really intense 4 years.
What was your first arcade game?
Computer Space. It was the fiberglass fancy cabinet. I created the design in modeling clay on my kitchen table, and then we scaled it up for the cabinet. And I learned an interesting lesson. There's such a thing as too much innovation. I mean, it was so out there compared to anything else that was in the market that people were baffled by it and quite frankly, a little scared.
Okay, tell me about Computer Space then. Was it a hit out of the box? Was it a failure at first? How did that all come together?
Computer Space has been classed as a failure, but I was just happy as pig in shit, because all of a sudden, I designed a product that had $3 million in sales. We were selling them for $1,200, and I think we sold 2,200 of them. And so it was a little less than $3 million, but all of a sudden, I was a farm boy from Utah, and getting royalty on $3 million in sales. I think our royalty was 7%. That was a good gig. That was more. I mean, when I moved to California, I was making $10,000 a year. So that was big money to me.
And the big game changer would be Pong, right? So tell me a little bit about Pong.
Sure. Pong was a game that was an accident. It was almost inadvertent. Kind of to lay a background, in 1962, a guy named Steve Russell programmed a game on the PDP-1 at MIT. It was called Star Wars, or Space War. And it was every PDP-1 and every Unix-based computer that had a video display had a copy of that game. And so everybody was playing it all over the place. Then there was sort of this heyday of video games in 1964. These were all on big mainframes. These were all at universities. And everybody was programming them to do all kinds of things. There were baseball games, and there were football games, and there were hockey games, there was ping pong games, and there were driving games, and but the sort of the queen of all these was computer space, or not? It was Space War. My initial idea of, and I played it incessantly at school, and programmed several games. I did the game of Fox and Geese, and I learned how to program using Fortran, using stacks of Hollow Earth cards, and doing games at that time. And I determined that if I could get a cheap computer, that they would work at the amusement park. Oh, I was working summers at the amusement park to put myself through college. And so one day after I graduated, I was in my lab, and I was working at Ampex in the video file division. And a computer came across my desk, an ad for a computer. It was $5,000. I said, that's cheap enough. I bet I can do this. So I started the design, and ended up creating the system that really drove the industry until about 1977. And so I had set up this company. We had licensed to Nutting Associates and had a little bit of royalty income, and we decided that we were going to get some other contracts. And so I got another contract with Bally. So all of a sudden, we had enough money to hire somebody. And my partner and I, Ted Dabney, and myself, and we hired Al Alcorn. And the technology was a little tricky. And I felt that it would be really good fun to have him just do a really, really simple game. And we'd done ping pong games on the big computers and that sort of thing, but I had just gone up to see, I'd heard that there was a video game for the home coming from Magnavox. It just scared the hell out of me. So I went up to Burlingame to determine whether or not there was some competition on the horizon. And I went in and I saw the Magnavox Odyssey, and I played it for probably a half hour. And I thought to myself, this is a horrible game. I don't have anything to worry about. And I went and driving back, and that happened to be the first day that Al Alcorn showed up for work. And when I got back, I described what I'd seen and that we didn't have any problem. I said, but why don't you see if you can design a good ping pong game and something that was good. And so we described what we thought a good ping pong game would have, and had score and sound and all that sort of stuff.
What were some of the things about the Magnavox Odyssey that you thought weren't good, that you could improve upon with Pong?
The biggest problem with the Odyssey was that you could control the ball after you hit the ball. I mean, the English and the motion and everything really came from twisting the knob, and that's kind of hokey. You know, you hit the ball and you hit it well or you didn't, and had no score, had no sound, and the images were fuzzy, and they were all controlled by what I call RC time constants. I mean, I can tell just by looking at it. Al literally, in a week, had a working prototype. A week. You know, he was a good engineer. In fact, I've often said Al Alcorn is the best engineer that I've ever known. He's really creative and resourceful and just clever as a snake. He's just really good. And we played it a little bit and said, hey, you know, this is pretty fun. And so we had gotten this contract from Bally, and I thought, geez, I bet maybe I can get them to take this, and it'll satisfy our contract 6 months early. You know, and then we could go off and do some other things. And they didn't want it. They decided you know, remember, there was no market testing, nothing. And so flying back from Chicago, I thought to myself, well, you know, I guess we could build a few. And while I was gone, they had put the unit on test, and it had filled up with quarters. You know, that old story. And so I said, we can make this. And we were off to the races.
And so when you made that leap, did you have any idea what you were in store for?
No. The next 2 years was an absolute blur, because it just seemed like there were not enough hours in the day if you cut out sleep entirely. And there was, you know, we were building a company, we were renting facilities, and we had no money. You know, so it was always this precarious structure of using every bit of your cash to buy parts, and then just hope to God that people would pay you in time for payroll to come around. I mean, the number of times that I didn't have payroll on Wednesday when payroll was on Friday. You know, and we called it dialing for dollars. You'd call the distributors and say, hey, I really need a check, but it's got to be here. You got to mail it today, otherwise I'm going to miss payroll. You know, and you shouldn't do that with your customers. You want your customers to think that you're, you know, really sound and stable and all that. And we were very precarious.
And were you prepared for that kind of pressure to have so many people relying on you to hit payroll each week?
I don't know if anybody's ever ready for that kind of pressure. I didn't actually think about it. It was just the hand that was dealt me. And I could have slowed down. But my belief is that when you have demand that's unsatisfied, you leave a sucking sound for potential competitors that may be better and more equipped than you. And so you really want to satisfy as much of the demand as you can, because you're weakening your competition. I always saw it as a giant race and a war, and that there were the dirty, rotten guys that were trying to come into the video game business, and it was my business, and damn it, you just shouldn't mess with it. And I tried very, very hard to put as many would-be competitors out of business as I could.
And so how much of success do you think is building and maintaining momentum?
Lots. Tremendous amount. And in fact, I really recommend that you don't get carried away with patents. You know, just go for it. And if you've got a bunch of people who are violating your patents, you know, just forget about it.
Okay, let's jump back to Pong a second. I actually have a question. The day that you decided to manufacture it, if you could go back to yourself then and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
What kind of advice would I give myself on the day that I decided that we were going to go into manufacture of Pong?
Yeah.
I would have created a partnership relationship with a company that had manufacturing resources. I think that by doing it all myself, I left significant opportunities for people to copy me because I just couldn't ramp up fast enough. I didn't have processes in place for purchasing. I didn't have processes in place for manufacturing. And I think I left a lot of money on the table by going it alone when I should have had a cooperative relationship with somebody who really knew how to build things in large quantities.
So do you think it's important for entrepreneurs to build those kind of infrastructure partnerships before taking the leap?
I don't think that you should create those kinds of partnerships too early. I mean, it's okay to plan for success as well as plan for failure. But I think you have to see that the success meter comes off the peg a little bit before you start running around doing some of those things. Understand that the life of an entrepreneur is one of too little time. There's so much that needs to be done that doing anything that's a waste of time is not good for you. So you're constantly trying to decide whether or not you're going to eat and sleep or work, or whether or not you're going to spend time with your family. I mean, the number of entrepreneurs that sacrifice their marriage on the altar of a business is tremendous. And this balance of life forces and opportunities is tremendous.
We've actually been told several times that there can be no balance in an entrepreneur's life. Entrepreneur cannot live a balanced life. Do you agree with that?
Can there be balance in an entrepreneur's life? There can be, but it's so leavened with fear that I know that for me, in the early days of Atari, I saw this as my opportunity for greatness, or importance. And that if I screwed it up, that this accident in space and time may not recur. And so doing less than everything you could was I perceived to kind of be risky, on that goal. And so was I totally unbalanced? Absolutely. And I think that I could only be balanced in retrospect, not when I was in the middle of the fight.
So even, I mean, it sounds like those days were gangbusters. You were leaping from success to success. Everything was getting bigger and bigger. And so even through that success, there was fear?
Absolutely. And understand that when you're in the middle of that growth and success and things like that, there are a million problems and problems that we had. I mean, we had one particular part in which we were trying to corner the market on it so that people couldn't copy our machines and just get because they couldn't get the chips. Well, we took a 15-cent part that we knew how many were manufactured, and we knew that we could corner the market on that, because to restart the line was a 6-month period, and we knew that 6 months keeping those other bastards out of our marketplace would be enough. So we started cornering the market. Well, the market got bid up so high that we found out that we owned 150% of the market. And we said, 150%? What? We know how many of these things were manufactured. Did a physical inventory. People had been stealing them out of our back room and selling it, taking them out the back door, selling them in the front door.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Now, in a company that was short on cash, that really, felt like a failure.
On the topic of fear, a lot of the entrepreneurs we've been talking to, we ask them if they have a fear of failure, and a lot of them are saying that they can't even imagine failure. And do you think that not being able to have that fear of failure is a critical attribute of being an entrepreneur, or is that dangerous?
Yeah. What I think that there needs to be a certain level of caution. And I know that when I sold Atari to Warner, I wasn't afraid of failing, but I was afraid of not seizing the opportunity that was in front of me because of lack of capital. And so I think to be prudent as a businessman, and just you can't take crazy risks, because when you're growing quickly and it's a new company and a new market, your company's actually quite fragile. You know, even if you're growing, even if you've got demand, even if you've got backlogs, all that stuff, there's a lot of fragility that you have. And I think you should always try to mitigate that fragility wherever you can. And to be damn the torpedoes full speed ahead only works for so long.
Now, is that Nolan the entrepreneur saying that, or is that Nolan the CEO saying that? Because you transitioned from founding entrepreneur to CEO, which is rare, right? Do you think it's fair to say that's rare, or do you not think so?
I don't know. There's a lot of people. I mean, you've got to say that Bill Gates transitioned to a wonderful, Steve Jobs.
Bill Gates walking around, though.
Yeah, but still, these are guys that I grew up with in a lot of ways. I mean, Steve Jobs worked for me, when he was 20, and I know him well, and these guys who are some of the iconic CEOs of the technology world, I think that they not only transitioned well, but they transitioned in a way that new standards have been set of what a CEO is.
Do you think it's important for a CEO to have been an entrepreneur?
Yes. I don't think it's mandatory, but I think it's extremely helpful, particularly if you're in an innovation company. I think that it's important for any CEO to have some affinity or something with being, or have affinity for being an entrepreneur. Because almost every new project, in some way is a startup. And we used to have, whenever we'd have something that we felt was not in our normal line of business, we'd put them in a different building and say, get away, because there's something really important about having an unstructured environment, and to give, the guy who's managing $5,000 in cash and say, just go buy what you need, not filling out any purchase orders in triplicate and what have you, and letting them have a refrigerator full of beer and bring their dogs in to sit on their thing, and nobody's wearing badges. That's what a startup mentality is like. And when you get bigger, all of a sudden you have to start tightening it down. And creativity fails when you have to tighten things down too much.
So as Atari is growing and you have new initiatives and you have new projects developing, you would treat each one of those as a startup?
Yes. As we grew, every time we would have a new initiative, we would try to treat it as much like a startup as possible. Meaning, we'd put it in a separate facility, we'd get them outside of the corporate structure, and just try to let them fast track it any way they could. Because the bureaucracy that you have to set up to control a company of 10,000 people is really not good for an entrepreneur. So I've actually been doing a lot of speaking lately to companies, talking about entrepreneurship. That is, a lot of companies want to be entrepreneurial. They want to be creative. They don't know how. And I've been teaching it and gotten some pretty good results. Because I know what I did at Atari, it worked. And I've been doing it all my life. And I've come up with a lot of companies with really innovative stuff. And it's not just in the game business. So you guys, know that area. But every company, no matter how staid and silly it is, it can become entrepreneurial if they just follow some of the precepts. And it has to do with trust. You've got to trust the guy who's going to take this thing to the moon and let him go with it. And 1 out of 7 times you're going to totally screw up. And you have to have this ability and this willingness to take a risk. Life is inherently risky, and you just have to do it.
So when you say 1 out of 7 times is a total screw up, is that the person is incompetent, the idea wasn't working? How does that happen?
Failure comes from all kinds of sources. Sometimes it's a people problem. Sometimes you just chose the wrong guy. Sometimes the idea itself was crappy. There was something that you didn't know. When you're dealing with innovation, a lot of times the market is not mature enough. It's not quite ready for you.
Are there key attributes to the entrepreneur that you think are really important to have, and maybe if someone doesn't have them, then they should rethink getting into starting a business?
I think there's 2 or 3 things that I look for that I consider to be critical in an entrepreneur. One is a sense of immediacy. And, there's some people that don't think of how you get things done now. And I used to have this trick, and I'd ask somebody during an interview a question that I know they couldn't know, but that they could find out literally by a quick telephone call. And I'd ask them that, and they'd say, I'll have to get back to you on that. And I said, well, no, think about it for a minute. And if you've got a couple of minutes, I've got a couple of minutes. And some guys would pick up the phone and other people wouldn't. As an example, they didn't have that sense of immediacy. The second one is a good entrepreneur has to be a problem solver. And that one's harder to quantify. The third one is I will never invest in an entrepreneur that says, my CFO can answer that. The entrepreneur has to understand money enough to know when he's making a business, a balance sheet decision, a cash flow decision, or a P&L decision. Because being a CEO is about balancing those things. And even in a studio, if a guy is starting a studio and doesn't know what his monthly burn is, to the penny, well, to a few dollars anyway, he's really not doing his job as the head of a company. You've got to have that. Your financial guys aren't making the decisions every day. You are, and you've got to have control of that. I took an accounting class when I was in college, and I thought of myself at the time as an engineer. Turned out to be the smartest thing I ever did. Because you can't live in China without knowing a little Chinese, and you can't live in business without knowing a little accounting.
Okay, so what are some of the specific sources of failure?
Many sources of failure. You can get the wrong people. You can have the wrong idea. The market's not mature enough. The technology doesn't work. Probably the hardest thing to do is to recognize the cause of failure. And when you're in the middle of it, every one of the failure points looks like it's fixable. I can hire different people. I can advertise more to see if I can develop the market. I can restructure the technology. I can put more money in software. I can rewrite the software. I can do various things. all of them boil down to spend more money. And you never know. It's just a judgment call. And I mean, the number of companies that I can think of which were going down this pathway and decided that that wasn't going, but they still had some VC money left, and they went over here and became very successful. You know, and that's where, if you get the right team, they have that ability to change on the fly. And a lot of VCs use that as an example to say, I'm going to bet on the jockey because I know that if this thing doesn't work, they're not going to stop. They're going to find something that will. Because in a lot of ways, business is about mixing it up in the market. You're out talking to people, and you're trying to sell them. And when you're trying to sell them, they're telling you what they actually want. And when, you know, and you're saying, isn't this good? And that's, you know, that's really ugly, but if you put a mustache on it and cut its hair, I'll buy it. And you know, and so the process of business is business. And if you are not arrogant, and if you go into a place and you're willing to learn, so many people think that the salesman's best asset is his mouth. It's not, it's his ears. And so many salespeople don't listen, they don't hear. And that's really valuable information to modify what you're doing.
Can you touch on the indie game sector right now and how it might relate to the early days of Atari? Or does it?
Well, indie games and 8-bit programming, things like that, I like to compare to a chess master will only play chess on the 17th century wood-carved pieces. Why? And the real answer is that these pieces remove any ambiguity about the playing environment. You know, because it's a weird-shaped bishop, you don't confuse it with a pawn, which sometimes happens when you're playing on a bizarre chess set. When you're playing with a really truncated set of hardware or units, it's all about the game. It's not about the graphics. It's not about the, you know, the other things. It's timing. It's user interface. It's sort of pure, the purity or the essence of game purity. And so that's kind of attractive to a lot of people. Now, we had that essence of game purity because the technology is so crappy that that's all we could do. And so we had to force ourselves to really focus on the timing and the game play and a lot of those things.
And what about in terms of indie games? You know, not just the 8-bit stuff, but there's a trend right now of developers working at major publishers who are going off and starting their own businesses. Sort of return to the garage, doing indie games, but almost at a AAA level, especially online.
I love entrepreneurship. I think that it's going to accelerate because as the tools enfranchise more value for less, all of a sudden what it enfranchises is creativity. Because a lot of these guys leave because they have ideas that have been shot down for the last 3 years, and then all of a sudden there's the Unity engine or some of these other things in which they said, if I can suck it up for 6 months, I can do my game in this environment. And yeah, I've got 6 months of savings, and I'll sleep on the floor. And I think that's a wonderful metric. You know, and what it'll do is we will see a burst forward of innovation. Because innovation is directly linked to risk. The more risk you're willing to take, the more likely you are to have some kind of an innovative thing come out. Less risk, all of a sudden, There's very little innovation in the pacemaker business.
Do you think that it's easier or harder to be technologically innovative now than when you started?
Easier. There's been the ability to be innovative today is really enabled by one, the difference in cost of hardware. I mean, an authoring station, as little as 5 years ago, would often cost you $60,000. That's a barrier to an awful lot of people. Today you can get a good set of authoring tools for under $2,000. You can program for an iPhone game, basically, on a $300 laptop. I mean, it's so there are no financial reasons to not do things, even if you're doing it nights and weekends while holding down a full-time job. I mean, I did most of the design work on the video game while I was still employed at Ampex, nights and weekends. And I knew that I had a technical solution before I quit.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit about Chuck E. Cheese? How did that happen?
Chuck E. Cheese was started inside Atari as a way to vertically integrate towards our market. We were selling games for $1,200 to $1,500 that in their lifetime would often earn $50,000. And so you look at that and you say, I'm on the wrong side of this business. But I didn't want to compete with my customers. And so I didn't want to compete for locations. I didn't want to compete for arcades. And so I said, I need to build a freestanding unit that I can have as a big arcade. And that was Chuck E. Cheese.
What was it like launching that?
It was great fun. I hired a guy named Gene Landrum and put him in a different building and set about to create. And he found the pizza formulas and all that. And the day we opened, we knew we were too small. Our first one was 5,000 square feet. It was huge for a pizza parlor in those days. Typical pizza parlor was 1,000 square feet. And so we thought going to 5,000, that was going to work. We knew it was way too small. And so the next one we did was 25,000 feet. That was a little too big. But we got it all figured out. And then I sold the company to Warner. And they said, we don't want to be in the pizza business. We're an entertainment company. And so they sold it to me. And so I bought it. And when I left Atari, I just spent all my time on it and really got it rocking.
What kind of stuff are you really excited about in the future of technology?
I think the mobile game platforms are going to be very, very powerful. I think we're just scratching the surface on using the accelerometers and the gyros and the GPS information that's now available to be integrated into games. I think that the augmented reality aspects of this screen that we now know as a scalar as well as a vector in time and a porthole into another world that's an overlay. I think that's really cool. And I think there's going to be a lot of fun things done on that. I think that the fact that 30% of the people that are watching television are now have a secondary screen going. And so now this link between television and movies, and instead of having to turn your cell phone off in a movie theater, I think that there's going to be some of this merging of multiple things where you have the world view and the personal private view of something that's going on. And remember that a lot of the theaters now are turning digital. And instead of playing or recording, there's no reason why those theaters can't be real-time computer generated with feedbacks and various things. And I'm going to be running that guy up in the corner that's got the black shoes on and something else. You know, I think that we're going to see a continual merging of the media, and new stuff is always fun, and some new stuff is really boring. So who knows?
So, of all the different projects you've done, what would you say is one of your favorites?
My next one. I am really a love the one you're with kind of guy. I really love the challenging part of a business, and I don't spend a lot of time on nostalgia, except when I'm giving interviews. Like right now, I'm very passionate about some of the new things we're doing at Atari. You know, I'm on the board. I'm working on anti-aging games, which I believe is very important. We are going to, save about 3 to 4 million people next year from dementia and losing their car in a parking lot and various things. I mean, we have so much proof that playing games when you're in your 70s and 80s keeps you mentally facile. And I'm working on a school project right now, which I'm going to see if I can fix education in America or in the world. And as soon as I finish that, I'll see if I can work on world hunger, and then I'm going to go on to world peace. So.